Welcome to the Power of Nature podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Waldo. In this show, I talk about how nature and the natural world can communicate with us, how it can communicate directly and individually with each of us, and how this can create immeasurable benefits for us in our lives. I share stories of my experiences doing this as part of a regular and ongoing practice, and I talk to others about their experiences with the power of nature as well. So join me as we go on a journey of learning about the power of nature, how it can communicate directly with us, and the impact that it can have on our own lives. Welcome back to the Power of Nature podcast. In today's episode, I'm talking about lizards. What lizards can teach us about receiving solutions, the solutions that we are wanting to know, wanting to become aware of, wanting to receive. So let's dive into this. I'm going to take a sip of my tea because my voice is a little froggy this morning. It's pretty early. Okay, so lizards. Here I am. I live in Montana. I have 3 horses and we have cats, we have dogs. I have 2 pet mice. If someone said to me, Michelle, you're going to have a lizard, I'd have been like, maybe. I don't know. It's not like I've had like a long-standing relationship with lizards. And if someone said to me, you're going to do an episode on lizards on this show, this early into the show, I would have maybe not believed it. But I found that lizards, actually, I have had a connection with them. And it's like in my interactions with them over the years, I've kind of observed them, and there are things that I've learned from their behavior and what they do that have taught me valuable things. Many things over the years, actually, but most recently, the things that I have become aware of have been taught to me by my son's bearded dragon. So, as I said, we have a pet lizard, we have a pet bearded dragon, and I feel like I want to just touch a little bit on my past history with lizards. So I wasn't really a big lizard fan at all. And I guess my connection with lizards started when I lived in Northern California. And we would have like these little I don't even know what kind of lizards they are. These like little guys that you would see out on the trail. And they were just, I don't know, there was something about them. They were very kind of curious in a very subtle way. They would sit very still, but yet also be kind of animated. I started to notice them like when I would just, stop paying so much attention to what was going on around me, because if I was in my head or moving too much, I never saw the lizards. When I would see the lizards or a lizard is when I would kind of stop and sit. I remember there's this beautiful spot in California, in Northern California, in Marin County, that overlooks the Pacific Ocean, and it's part of a mountain that overlooks San Francisco called Mount Tamalpais. And there's a spot on Mount Tamalpais where there's this really cool view, and there's kind of like a seat, a bench, if you will, made of rock, and it overlooks the Pacific Ocean, and you can even see, unless there's fog, you can see the city of San Francisco, and it's this beautiful spot. And it's kind of in this grove of trees with this rock, kind of a collection of rocks, and then someone made a bench there. And sitting there, kind of pondering, just taking in the view because it's incredible. Sometimes I would just go and sit there, and before long I started to notice these like little, like a little lizard or two would kind of pop up out of nowhere, out of the rocks, and they would just kind of sit there. Well, they weren't sitting, they were just standing, but I was sitting, and they would just kind of look at me and be very still and kind of quiet. Sometimes they would kind of like stand up a little bit with their front legs, kind of like going up a little higher. But I always felt, I don't know, I felt like I said, I wasn't really, it's not like I was fond of lizards. I would never hurt a lizard, but it's never like I had a major connection with them until these little guys, I noticed them. I started noticing them, and there was just something so cool about their energy. There was just something so, I don't know, friendly and curious, but yet not curious as if they're gonna walk up on your hand or anything like that. Just curious, but also self-contained. I don't know. They just kind of intrigued me, and I developed a real sense of respect for them and connection. Anytime I would see them out, if I was hiking or if I was sitting, I just kind of like would notice them and be like, yay. I would feel really good. If I ever tried to kind of get closer to them, there was a certain level of closer proximity they would let me get to, but not very much. And then they would just really quickly move away, so they weren't naive to like the potential dangers of humans, but they also weren't afraid to come out. And it was kind of an interesting thing. So that was my kind of first, I think, awareness of lizards. My second thing that I'm really aware of is learning a little bit about what are those guys called? Iguanas. Actually, they're iguanas. So I remember when I was single and I was living in San Francisco and California, and living in the city, and there was a neighborhood called Hayes Valley, which is probably very different than it was 20 some years ago. But back then it was kind of like a gentrifying neighborhood, where it had been known as like a more dangerous neighborhood, and then kind of like some cafes and shops, etc., moved in. And so it was kind of like a place where there were like smaller boutiques. I have no idea what it's like these days. The city of San Francisco has just changed so much since I lived there. So I don't know what it's like these days. But back then there was a small boutique that was owned by a woman. It was like a women's dress boutique. And I remember going in there one time, checking out the clothes. The owner was really sweet. It was not like a particularly high-end boutique, but it was more like her personalized stuff. And she was this really nice lady. And I would go in there and kind of check out her stuff. I liked that she curated, I don't know, she just curated stuff. She handpicked stuff that she liked, and it wasn't expensive. It was just had a personality, and she had a personality. So I had a good experience in this store. Even though it was like a little boutique, it was, I don't know, it had a good feeling. So I would go in there, and I'd had conversations with the owner a few times. I have a lot of hair that can be very curly, and she had curly hair. And one day I went in and her hair was completely straight. And I was like, what happened? And so we got into a long conversation. So over the course of buying things from her a few times, you know, some small things, and I think a dress here and there, you know, I developed this, like, I don't know, just an enjoyment of going into the store. So one day I went in and I was looking at stuff that was hanging up on the wall on a rack, and I was kind of flipping through like articles of clothing on a hanger on a rack, and I looked up and I jumped back in like complete fear because on the top of the clothing rack was an iguana, and I didn't know there was an iguana that lived there at that point. I mean, I had no idea. And you don't really expect to just suddenly see an iguana on your clothing rack when you're not expecting it. Well, it turns out that the owner of the shop, this was her iguana, and she would bring the iguana in. And I don't know how I never noticed it before, but suddenly this day I did. And I was just totally fearful and taken aback because I didn't have any experiences with iguanas. And to me, I had not really liked reptiles very much. I mean, I would never hurt an animal or anything like that, but I didn't particularly like reptiles. And aside from like these little lizards that I just talked about, I didn't really think anything about reptiles. Well, an iguana is kind of a larger on the scale of a lizard size, or at least compared in my mind to the little guys that I would see on the trail, which were only like, I don't know, like 2-3 inches, maybe 4 inches with their tail, you know, and maybe like an inch or two wide maximum. So they weren't very big. And this iguana was very big. It was an adult iguana. It was very big. And it was on this rack, and I just was totally taken aback. But I liked this woman, and she's quirky and sweet and kind, and I just kind of felt like her personality helped me get over my initial uncertainty about a large lizard being her pet living in the store. Well, I don't know that the pet lived in the store, but being in the store, I guess it kind of went as part of like lizard daycare with her to work, to her business, which I had never known. And so here I was, you know, taking in this iguana, and I at first just kind of tried to kind of steer clear of the iguana. But because I had a relationship with this woman, I started to talk to her more about it. And I started to become more comfortable with the iguana, even though my initial reaction was kind of like, being a little nervous around it. And I started to discover, like, I had no idea, the iguana looked kind of spiky, kind of a little scary, reminded me, of a small alligator or crocodile or, I don't know, just kind of like, and I didn't really have experiences with those. So any perception that I have was, they would attack you. They were cold-blooded killers kind of thing. I knew an iguana wasn't that, but it just kind of triggered me. But I really liked this woman, and she was really sweet, and this was her iguana, and I was kind of fascinated by the whole thing. And what I came to understand was just how personable this iguana was, how actually cool this iguana was. It got to the point where I started to realize that I got comfortable enough to touch the iguana and to realize that when you touched it, it almost kind of stretched up into your touch the way maybe a cat does. If you go to pet a cat and scratch its ears or run your hand along its back, it'll kind of raise up to, seeking that affection. And this is what the iguana did. You could kind of pet the iguana on its head and it would kind of reach up, or it would kind of seek affection. And this kind of blew my mind because I never had that kind of a relationship with a reptile or a lizard of any kind. My extent of positivity towards any kind of lizard or reptiles was either A, avoidance, or B, my curiosity and, kind of growing connection and respect for these little tiny lizards that were out on the trail that I would see when I was out hiking, which I talked about earlier. But now there's this iguana, which is pretty big. I think it was maybe about, 3 feet, 2 feet, maybe 2 feet, but stout. I'm not very good at figuring out the measurement. Maybe 3 feet is probably way too big. 2 feet might even be too big. I don't know. I'm kind of holding my hands apart about the size of my monitor. So maybe that's 18 inches, 12 inches. I don't know. You can Google the size of an iguana, but it was an adult iguana and it's a larger iguana, and it totally blew my mind. So now, fast forward, these are my experiences with lizards, these little lizard guys, and, I call them guys, but whether they're male or female. And then this iguana kind of made me think differently of lizards. And I started to notice if I ever went into a pet store, like Petco or PetSmart, which we have in the United States. I'm going to take a sip of my tea here. When I would be walking through to get some other, find some other item, cat or dog related item, I would see sometimes they had little pet lizards. What I now know is those were baby bearded dragons in most cases. Sometimes they had chameleons or geckos, or I don't know, other kinds of little lizards. But the ones that I always noticed were, I now realize, were baby bearded dragons. And, they reminded me of these little lizards that I would see out on the trail. And they kind of also seemed smaller than an iguana, which, while I really respected and really changed my perspective on iguanas from this woman in the shop, it seemed like a really big lizard to take on. Whereas in the Petco and PetSmart, when I saw these little guys that were baby bearded dragons, and I didn't really realize how baby they were, they just, I don't know, they would look at me and I would look at them, and it reminded me of my times on the trail, out, in nature, connecting with these like little guys in California. So it turns out that about a year, 2 years ago, maybe, I don't know, time is flying by. We ended up getting my older son a dog, a puppy. I can't remember the exact order of this. I, for some reason, decided to get 2 pet mice out of the blue, which is a whole other conversation. And my younger son, we wanted to get him a pet, and he had wanted an axolotl. Well, actually, he wanted a snake, and I did not want a snake. The kind of snake he wanted was going to live for like 10 or 15 years, and I'm like, if you go off to college or whatever, I don't want to be left taking care of a snake. So we agreed that we would get him, a reptile that would be one that we would be comfortable, if we needed to, taking care of that reptile, if need be. And so we went to the store and we got a bearded dragon. And that was a huge world to enter into because it seemed so simple. It seems so simple. There are a lot of things I know right now. Like I now know, like don't get a reptile at Petco or PetSmart. Didn't know that back then. Don't listen to what they tell you about how to take care of a pet bearded dragon, because you're going to get a lot of misinformation that isn't actually good for the bearded dragon. Didn't know that back then either. It just kind of seemed like, okay, we're like, what do we need? We're going to buy all the stuff we need. They're like, oh, all you need is this small tank. And we're like, no, what size are we actually going to need? Let's just get that from the beginning. Well, they gave us misinformation on that. They gave us misinformation on what to feed it and all of that. So for the first 9 months of this bearded dragon's life that we had it, we were learning a lot about the proper way to offer a suitable home for the bearded dragon, because there's a lot of information that was not accurate. So that was a big learning curve. But along the way, I ended up having lots of interactions with my son's bearded dragon. In the very beginning, I was doing more of the taking care of the dragon than my son was, because we were learning a lot from our misconceptions about how to take care of the dragon. And I really started to develop, I would take the dragon out in my office. I would walk around with him. I would hold him. And I really kind of started to watch him and learn more about him, to try to discern, like, are we doing the right things by him? Like I said in the beginning, it was so confusing because there's so many people that were saying so many different things about how to take care properly of a bearded dragon, and we were trying to do the right things. Like, for example, the enclosure we bought originally that we were told would be fine was nowhere near big enough for how big this bearded dragon was going to get. So we made the transition. We learned about how to get a different enclosure and all of that. And while it might seem like this isn't relevant to this episode, it is, because it was in going on that journey that I started to really, out of a desire to want to be a good steward of this bearded dragon, because we brought this bearded dragon into our lives and we wanted to, take care of the bearded dragon in a way that was, helpful and would be loving and caring towards the bearded dragon. So I started really observing, you know, observing like how like when you're trying to take care of something, you're looking at, do they seem okay? Do they seem like they're, thriving? Do they seem like something's wrong? So I started to really kind of, I don't know, inadvertently study our bearded dragon, especially as I saw the bearded dragon get from like, I don't know, like 2 inches to how, I think the bearded dragon from head to tail now is maybe about 12 inches long, maybe 9 inches, something like that. So, there's been a lot of changes. And there's so many interesting things that I have discovered in this, in observing this bearded dragon. And like, I think one of the biggest things is noticing how it's almost like noticing how little the bearded dragon moves. And it can seem like nothing is going on. Like they just stand there and they don't move for a long time. They're not really doing anything. They're not really like, in our world, action shows decisions and doing things, and this person's productive, and this person's achieving this, and this person's doing that. Look at all that they're doing. Well, in contrast, someone that just kind of stops and sits could be kind of labeled as lazy or not proactive or not really doing much. Just kind of like, a lump on a log kind of a mentality. I mean, these are kind of conceptions, cultural conceptions that I think we grow up with. So when you see a lizard just standing there, you can kind of think, well, not much is going on, and you may have different ways of thinking about that, like, oh, that's just lizard brain, or they don't really have anything going on, or whatever. Well, one of the biggest things I've learned about nature is how many misconceptions we have about what really is going on in nature that we humans deem as something stupid or different than us, and therefore we think it's not as valuable or to be valued or honored as us. It's like, if they're not moving around a lot, they must not have intelligence. If they're not doing things the way we do it, they must be stupid. I mean, there's a lot of that goes on with people. Probably if you're listening to this podcast though on nature, you probably have a different perspective, because I don't think those people would be drawn to a podcast on nature, because they think of nature as something that is just less than, or just something outside, and separate from anything related to what they're doing. I'm guessing if you've been drawn to this podcast, you're in some way, shape, or form, you feel a connection to nature. You feel some kind of, attraction to nature, and a respect and admiration for nature. And what I've come to understand over and over and over again is that it is, really human folly. Is that the word, folly? Yeah, it's folly. I haven't had enough caffeine this morning. I'm going to take a sip of my tea. There we go. Okay. Yeah, folly. Folly is the perfect word for this, because folly means lack of good sense or foolishness. And the more that I learn about nature, and any time that, anything I ever think seems, kind of seemed like there wasn't much going on there, or, what's that body part for, uh, or what is that element of nature really doing? That it's an act of folly. Bottom line, it's an act of foolishness, because things that are nature made and natural, I find there is so much more going on than what we often are aware of. Like the reasons for why that aspect of nature is doing what it's doing, or like I mentioned in the case of our body, that's another example. I discovered this where through my family's health journey, sometimes you can come across people who have views like, well, let's just remove this part of the body because it doesn't really do anything. I encountered this when my kid was young, and there was a certain body part where it was like, let's just remove that because it doesn't really have a function. And I later came to realize, and the science, quote unquote, came to realize that it did have a function. There is always a function. There's always kind of like an underlying, you could call it divine, divine meaning bigger purpose, a bigger purpose that is going on. And such is the case with nature and with all aspects of nature as well. It goes, there's so much we can learn from nature. There's so much we can learn from natural things. But just because we don't often perceive, the lens through which we perceive nature can sometimes be dismissive of what is going on. And I have found that to be the act of folly. It's an act of foolishness, of not realizing there is an innate intelligence, there is an innate purpose in something going on. And this is what I talk about a lot in the show. And I also am talking about it right now in relationship to this to lizards and to our bearded dragon, because I started watching the bearded dragon to try to understand. Initially it was just because out of like desperation, like here we got this bearded dragon. I realized that we had misconceptions about how to take care of the bearded dragon. Then I had to start kind of watching the bearded dragon to start understanding how to better care for the bearded dragon. And I started to observe things about the bearded dragon. Like I started to see that when it seems like the bearded dragon isn't doing quote unquote anything, that actually the bearded dragon is doing a whole lot of things that I realize are a whole lot of things that I could do at various times in my life that would serve me. It's almost like the bearded dragon, through its actions of doing things innate to its own, thriving, are beneficial things that I could learn and apply to my life as well. And so what I started to notice is, for example, that the bearded dragon, before we got the bigger enclosure, we had this small enclosure, and I realized that I wanted to be able to give the bearded dragon access to more things to explore. And so we let the bearded dragon loose in well, initially it was, first we didn't know how to do it. we created a little puppy pen because we were worried that the bearded dragon would crawl under something and we wouldn't find it. But what we discovered was just this pattern of how the bearded dragon would just kind of like go out and like just stop and kind of take everything. Well, okay. On the outside, what it looked like was just the bearded dragon is stopping and not doing anything. Not doing anything, just literally holding still. And in our human folly, we can look at that and be like, what is up with this animal? Why are they not doing something? We could even in our folly be like, well, they must not be very smart, because we've had this view that like smart means moving, smart means doing something, smart means action. And if you're not doing that, you must not be very smart. And the bearded dragon would just stand there. Kind of like stand there for a long time. But what's really interesting that I started to realize, because after a while, the bearded dragon then would have, it's like, I started to see that when the bearded dragon acted, because it would stand still for a long time and then it would take action. And that action was really deliberate and really purposeful. So I'll never forget the first day when we brought the bearded dragon out into my office, and like initially the bearded dragon just stopped and just kind of like didn't move, and we stood there, like my son and I were there for a long time, like waiting and waiting and waiting and kind of waiting and wondering like what is going on. We brought this bearded dragon out so it'd have like a place to explore and whatever, but the bearded dragon just stopped and didn't even move, right? Eyes were open but didn't move, didn't look like it was looking around, just was there. But after a while, what's interesting is the bearded dragon suddenly, just when we thought nothing was going to happen, the bearded dragon isn't going to dart under any like little cabinets where we can't get it out or it might be in danger or whatever. Just when we thought that like the bearded dragon isn't going to go anywhere, the bearded dragon suddenly just like took off at high speed like a light for a destination. And it was the craziest thing to watch because I started to realize, because then we saw this happen again and again several times, that really what the bearded dragon was doing was not some stupid thing of just standing there and not doing anything for a long period of time. The bearded dragon was taking everything in. Taking everything in almost like not looking around, but like I started to really appreciate that. I started to learn how much small things affected the bearded dragon. Like, if you have a bearded dragon, you know that like even the smallest change can, kind of like upset their rhythms. We discovered this, just even when the bearded dragon was in his, the bearded dragon's name is Pixel, which is a very cute name. I don't want to keep calling the bearded dragon, so call him Pixel because that's his name. We started to notice that Pixel would get, would respond with the smallest change. Like you move around one item in the enclosure and it's almost like, the world ended kind of a thing. And that was the way we, through our human folly perception, would perceive it. But really what it was is I started to learn and understand just how sensitive the bearded dragon Pixel is, how sensitive they are. They're not stupid, and they're not doing anything. They are really, really sensitive to the most subtle changes. The most subtle changes, because they're very, very aware. And they become very, very aware by not kind of just jumping into action. It's like they really stop and they just kind of open up their awareness and take everything in. And they see all kinds of things, like, because their awareness is so almost like zoomed in, they notice things that often we people would never even notice, and that's what also allows them to be able to, catch bugs and whatever, I guess, probably, in the wild, they can perceive the smallest, they can hold still, and then they can perceive the smallest amount of activity, and then that allows them to hold really still and then be able to, reach out and take a bug, catch a bug or whatever. But I started to also notice just how that is also kind of like how the bearded dragon functions. Like when we would take Pixel out in my office, he would really just hold still for a long time. But then when he took action, that action was it's like it was so decisive. It was so clear. It was like there was no uncertainty. There was no hesitation. It was like he was incredibly, like human terms would be, strategic about where to go and what to do. Like, it wasn't erratic. It wasn't ill-conceived. It was actually very much the opposite. So I started to notice these patterns of where the lizard would be really still, and then the lizard would take a very deliberate action. And that deliberate action was often very informed by what was in the lizard's kind of like best interests, whether it's for food or it's for safety or it's for whatever it is. And, I started to kind of really think about how helpful that is and can be to humans. How many times have we learned to just act, to just react, to just act and react in very quick response. Now, there can be benefit to that, right? Like if you're out somewhere and a tree is falling down on you and you hear the noise, right? You want to be able to react and get out of the way. But I also think there are a lot of times where I've discovered that I get out and I react to things very quickly in ways that haven't been as beneficial as if I were to practice more like what Pixel does, which is to just stop and pause and take things in and really become attuned. Now, one of the things I talk a lot about in my other podcast, Creating from the Inside Out, Embracing Our Creative Power, is energy. And energy is something that is, and I'm not talking about energy kind of the way that most scientists talk about energy. I'm talking about energy as being kind of like this, although there is a connection with that, but I think the scientific view of energy is different from what I'm talking about based on where scientific studies have been so far to date, what they've focused on. But energy is kind of like an underlying thing, if you will, that when we understand more about energy and our own energy, we understand more about, our lives and ourselves, I find. And I talk all about that. And so what I have really come to understand about energy is I didn't even really understand that this kind of energy exists in everything formally until about 24 years ago, I guess. Maybe before that, actually. I started to become aware of it, but that there's, this energetic energy underlying everything, that is everything, but in particular, it's I really notice it in natural and nature and natural things. That energy is something that most of us are not attuned to. We don't tune into it because energy, the shifts of energy it's almost like seem very subtle. And when we're focused on a lot of like big action and big things happening, and we're not even aware that there is underlying energy, we kind of discard things that seem small. But a small shift of energy can create a big reaction in the physical world. We've come to learn that and prove that in science. But it's also something with us humans. Like, have you ever noticed if your own perspective on something has changed, your energy on something has changed? It can have outward repercussions that can be really significant, right? Like, let's say you go into a room and you're feeling really, your energy is one of annoyance. The outcome of what you experience and what you do can be very different than if your energy changes to feeling calm. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that small energetic shifts can have big kind of external physical manifestations. And what this means is that, tying this back to lizards, is that lizards are really attuned to energy. They don't need to be moving all the time. They stop and they're attuned. And this is what I've discovered with people too, and myself. The more I slow down, the more I get in sync with myself, which I talk about in all of my shows, and listen to my inner self, the more attuned to energetic changes, to subtle things that may not be seem so big, but they are big. They can have big repercussions and create big shifts in our lives. And the point that I'm trying to make is that a lizard, like our bearded dragon, Pixel, he knows how to stop and take in and observe and really kind of tune in and then make a decision. Or allow the information to come to him, to then when he acts, it is an act that serves his best interest. And this is the kind of lesson that I'm trying to get to with this whole episode, which is that is something that really can benefit us as humans. It's something that I have learned a lot over and over again, that so many times when I've like rushed out and I've kind of jumped the gun on doing something, and there is a time for that. There is a time and a place for fast action and making choices, but there's also a time for where we just slow down and we tune in and we become much more attuned to the very small things, It's this like energy, if you will, just like Pixel, our bearded dragon does. He just stops and he takes it all in. And then what happens is, through taking in his connection to all the energy, whatever is relevant for his best interest comes to him. And then that's when he acts. So many times we as humans, we react and respond to what is outside of us as opposed to observing and stopping and tuning into what is inside of us and letting kind of like the right inspiration dictate what we do. That's actually it's like the opposite of what the lizard does. The lizard doesn't have some preconceived notion of what it should do. It takes everything in through observation and through sensing the energy and through stopping, and its own connection with its source, with its own knowing, allows it to receive then the impulse for an action that then is in its own best interests. And this is something that we can do as well. And we can learn from Pixel and other lizards. We can learn that this can be a beneficial practice for us as humans. What I have found is that the more attuned to energy that I have gotten, the more that I have learned to kind of slow down and not assume that everything has to be big and huge, and that actually nature often teaches me that it is in the most still moments, it is in the most quiet moments, it is in the moments where I just sit and I just take it in, that I have experiences with birds, and I notice bugs, and I notice deer, and I notice all kinds of things that I wouldn't otherwise if I was running around. But also what happens when I am just stopping and I'm just observing and I'm taking it in and I'm kind of tuning into the energy of that which is around me, my own inner self, and the nature that is within me and the nature that is outside of me that I'm experiencing also communicates what is right for me in that next moment. And this is what I mean about solutions. I did an episode that I'm actually going to be releasing. I think it's going to come after this episode gets released, this episode of The Power of Nature. But I did an episode with, for my other podcast, Creating from the Inside Out, with a guest, Betsy Russ Hicks. And we talked about, she talked about kind of like going into nature. She mentioned that when she feels really, she didn't quite use these words, but she'll go into nature. She'll go for a walk on the beach, or she kind of wants to gather her thoughts or feel better, or she'll go somewhere into nature. It was just a passing comment. In this show, I talk about doing that deliberately all the time because of the amazing benefits. But what she was getting at is she feels a sense of something. She feels a sense of calm. She feels a sense of something, of rightness. Well, what I've come to understand is that rightness is beyond just a reduction of stress. It's beyond it. It is a reduction of stress. It is it relieves our anxiety. It does help us feel just centered and more at peace. All those things happen for sure. But there is more that happens when we go into nature and we start as an active and ongoing practice. When we go into and we connect with nature and we connect with the energy of everything. And this is what our bearded dragon, the lizard, does and teaches us, is we just can go in and stop and just pause and take it in. Nature always delivers, and nature delivers. And I believe our inner self is what does this as well. Our inner self communicates, with us in concert with nature. What is it that is right for us to know? In the case of the interview with Betsy Hicks Russ, she was talking about she might receive an inspiration. As a matter of fact, she even talked in the show about how she got an idea for sharing on social media a video of her son that she ended up sharing that became very popular. And then it led to wonderful things like her becoming a supporter of helping her son has a diagnosis of autism, and he's an adult. And she went on, because of that impulse, to offer amazing benefits to many other parents who also have children that have received a diagnosis of autism and are not understanding how to navigate, that experience. And Betsy's experience in nature inspired her to start talking about her experiences through these videos that she was sharing of her son. And those she started then doing more of and more of and more of, and that started benefiting these other people in helping them. And my point is that not only did it do that, which benefited all these people, which is kind of like, this is what I've discovered about nature, is that nature always has so many benefits. There's so many more benefits than we can even see, right? She also got an inspiration, or it was like she had created this vest that could help other people. And then these videos became an avenue for how to reach people that she could help share this creation of this vest with. I'm using her as an example, but I could use lots of people and myself of examples of when we go into nature and when we start slowing down like the bearded dragon and we just start listening. Our inner self in sync with nature can bring us solutions to what it is that we truly want in our own core, at our nature, of what we want that will not only serve what we truly want for our best interests, but also will benefit many, many other people and can benefit the world at large. This is what I talk about in the Creating from the Inside Out podcast a lot. And that's why I had Betsy Hicks Russ on that show. But it's something that the more we go into nature, the more I learn about nature, the more I interact with wildlife and natural things, I tune into nature and how nature is in sync with doing this all the time. And when I go into nature, I receive not just one benefit, not just stress reduction, but I receive ideas. I receive communication. I receive information. I receive a perfect impulse after stopping and slowing down and taking it in, just like the bearded dragon does. I receive a perfect impulse that is something that is an inspired impulse. It is not a reactive to my past history and I'm reacting out of fear impulse. It is an impulse that is in sync and beneficial to the greater world. And nature always shows me this. Nature in the natural world has shown me this over and over and over again. That's what this podcast is all about. And when we go into nature as an ongoing practice, or we interact with elements of nature, whether it's our bearded dragon or even our dog, our cat, our horses, a deer, a plant, we just even go into the woods, we stand on the mountain, we go into nature, or we observe nature, we can receive the benefits of this wisdom that is beneficial not only to us and gives us ideas about not only what we want that is for our highest good, but is also in alignment with what is beneficial to more than just us. Because nature and the natural world is never about just one thing. It is always operating as part of you can use the word divine plan, a larger, vaster ecosystem of a plan that has benefit for multitudes of people and beings and energetic presences on this planet. The mountains and the plants and the animals and humans, and how we be with each other and we work in concert with each other. And you might think it's a far stretch that a lizard like a bearded dragon could teach us this, but it's not. It's not. And this is what I talk about in this show. I talk about, how we can go on a journey of morphing our perspective on an element of nature. I didn't have a strong connection with lizards when I first started. I didn't. I started to have these really curious experiences with these little lizards on these trails, in California, and be like, these guys feel really, I don't know, there was something about them. And then I had this amazing experience with this iguana that exhibited affection and this amazing kind of I don't want to use the word intelligence because it's a different, but it is this amazing spirit and energy and innate intelligence. And then I experienced this with these little bearded dragons that I would see, and now having a bearded dragon and learning through our bearded dragon and having the bearded dragon remind me of things and help me understand things, even be able to articulate to all of us things I've learned about how nature and the natural world can help us get in sync with solutions. Pixel, when he goes out and he's still for a really long time, and then when he makes an action to run somewhere or to do something, it is a very inspired and informed action. And we can experience the same thing. We can receive solutions from nature by doing the same thing, by learning what it is we can learn from this little bearded dragon named Pixel. And there's so many things we can learn from nature. So many things. I cannot even begin to scratch the surface of what we can learn from nature that is not just one answer, but so many. So many. And when we think there is just one answer, I've discovered that is just human folly, because there is so much more going on. There is so much more. And I don't know about you, but I'm open to discovering all of it, to understanding the joy and the wonder of all of it, because it's beautiful. And I feel more connected to nature, and I feel more inspired by the solutions I receive every time I interact with everything that's natural and nature made. And you can too. This is something everyone has the capacity to do. It's not something we're trained to do, but it is something we're innately taught to do. But everyone has the capacity to do what I'm talking about. And in today's episode, I'm just giving one example of my journey with lizards and what a lizard can teach us about solutions that serve us in amazing ways, but also create solutions for not just us, but for the benefit of many, many others. Because nature always is in sync with all of nature and the natural world. And understanding this more and more, I find, is very beneficial for all of us. And this episode has gone on longer than what I had expected, and I'm going to end on that for today's episode. Until the next time. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of the Power of Nature podcast. To learn more about me and my other offerings, you can visit my website at michellewaldo.com. That's MICHELLEWALDO.com.